One of my rules for being on these video platforms is I try as much as possible not to respond to bad faith rage bait content. There's an endless churn of it. You'll get caught up in trying to respond to every single falsehood, and the people who do it precisely because it gets engagement, and there's no use engaging with it. Occasionally though, very occasionally, I do see something that to me makes me think I should say something about this. It's in my wheelhouse and it represents maybe a common bit of misinformation, a common misconception, and it's worth speaking about. And I'm gonna do that here. I saw this video on TikTok of this woman trying to explain in a kind of smug, I know this, but you didn't, you don't know real history kind of way, that the origins of chattel slavery in the United States lie with black people. Black people are responsible for it. Here's a clip from her video.
What I said in my video was that black people created slavery. They started slavery.
All of this centers around the person of Anthony Johnson, who in 1653 in Virginia sued to hold John Castore for life in order to keep him from absconding over to another master. This was an indentured servant who was trying to go off to another person. Anthony Johnson was an African indentured servant, and his successful suit holding Castore in lifetime bondage is one of the first legal sanctions of slavery in the North American colonies. And so this person uses this to say, oh, the origins of this are with black people. You'll notice here that I am using the term of African descent because blackness, as we understand it today, didn't quite exist yet. It's sort of an anachronism to talk about Anthony Johnson being black. He is racially black today, that's how we would identify him, but he would understand himself to be African most likely. Not even African, a particular tribe that he's from. And blackness in that sense is both a legal category, but also a social category. Is it developing in the 1650s, but is still kind of taking shape. But that's a little besides the point. Anyway, as it so happens, many years ago, not many years ago, like over a decade ago, I, with a former colleague of mine, Rebecca Onion, did a podcast for Slate magazine that was the history of slavery. It was deeply researched, highly produced, and still available. If you go to slate.com/believeacademy, you can go listen to the History of Slavery podcast. And as part of that, we encountered a lot of myths about slavery, a lot of misconceptions, and we wrote an article dealing with the biggest ones that came up again and again and again. So I'm going to read from a portion of that article because it deals with exactly this. I literally wrote about this 11 years ago. So here we go. The first slave owner in America was black. That's the misconception. Is it true? It depends on how you parse the timeline. Anthony Johnson, the black ex-indentured servant whose bio opened the first episode of our podcast, did sue to hold John Castore for life in 1653, and the resulting civil court decision remanding Castore to Johnson's ownership was one of the first known legal sanctions of slavery in the colonies. That phrase, "one of," is crucial. The ship Desire brought a cargo of Africans from Barbados to Boston in 1634. These people were sold as slaves. In 1640, John Punch, a runaway servant of African descent, was sentenced to lifelong slavery in Virginia, while the two European-born companions who fled with him had their indentures extended. In 1641, the passage of the Body of Liberties provided legal sanction for the slave trade in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Whether or not Anthony Johnson was the first American slaveholder, he was certainly not the last black person to own slaves. Quote, "It is a very sad aspect of African American history that slavery sometimes could be a colorblind affair," writes Henry Louis Gates Jr. Some black slaveholders bought family members, though this humanitarian arrangement doesn't account for all of the history of black slave owning, as Gates points out. Bottom line, even if Anthony Johnson was the first person in the North American colonies to hold a slave, even if many black people across the years held slaves, that doesn't erase the fact that it was the racially based system of hereditary slavery that harmed the vast majority of black people living within it. The fact that some members of an oppressed class participate in oppression doesn't excuse that oppression. It also doesn't eliminate the larger socio-political, political-economic context of what we're talking about. As the answer points out there were instances of sanctioned slavery before then. I think you should understand the Anthony Johnson situation as part of the evolving law of slavery in the Virginia colony, right? It doesn't emerge ex nihilo. It develops over time. And in response to particular conditions, in response to the decline of easily available land for indentured servants, in response to rebellions among indentured servants. Bacon's rebellion stands out in particular here, in response to the particular exigencies and demands of plantation agriculture in the period. That's mainly tobacco in Virginia and other agricultural staples, and rice in South Carolina, rice and indigo. Depending on the commodities, depending on the situation, depending on where the enslaved people are coming from. Remember, British North America is only getting a relatively small percentage of the overall enslaved people coming to the New World. Depending, you get different legal regimes. And this was part of the legal regime in the Virginia colony. But it's a real stretch to go from Johnson to say, well, black people are to blame for chattel slavery. That's not really the case. Johnson was an unusual exception, right? The occasional, the rare black slave owner, but the vast majority of people who are masters of indentured servants, who own slaves as time goes on, are of European extraction, British particularly. By the time the slave system is fully entrenched in British North America, and particularly in those southern colonies, the overwhelming vast majority of slave owners are people of British descent, European extraction again, and the vast majority, or pretty much all of the people enslaved, are black. And by that point, you can describe them as such. A system of racial categories has been imposed, and these people who came from a variety of different tribes in mostly West Africa are now, on these shores, simply black. All of this to me seems very straightforward and no particular cause for blame or guilt or whatever. It's just what happened, right? It's what happened in our history. But I think, and I'm maybe psychologizing this creator, I think that for some people, a combination of partisanship and ideology, she appears to be a strong supporter of Donald Trump, and some kind of sublimated guilt leads them to want to say, no, you can't blame me for this. It's their fault. They are to blame for their own misery. Again, this is kind of silly, right? Like in 1860, we have the census of slavery in the United States, and it's not as if there's some large class of black slave owners. They're all white Americans. The people who codified slavery into the American political system in 1787 were white Americans. The people who made their fortunes were white Americans, right? Like, that's the dynamic. This was a racial system of slavery, of hereditary slavery. But it ought not be any skin off of anyone's back to acknowledge that. It's not an attack on today's white Americans to say that white Americans in the past were part of this system. The way I see things is that people ought not feel guilty for things they didn't do. What you should feel are obligations. And so we are inheritors of a really ugly past, all of us. And that imposes on us certain obligations to do something about the effects of that past, about the continuations of that past, about what that past means today for us in the present. You can feel guilty about not living up to those obligations. You can feel guilty about not realizing that you have those obligations, but no one should feel guilty about a slaveholder in the past. You can if you want to, right? If your family was involved in this and you can trace that back, fine to feel guilt. I'm not saying that you can't feel guilt. I'm not even saying that guilt isn't useful, but that guilt itself isn't a thing that anyone is demanding of anyone. But you should feel an obligation. Ta-Nehisi Coates, many years ago, wrote a line that I still think about all the time. He said that you can't be an a la carte patriot. You can't be an a la carte patriot. If you are looking to the past and saying, I'm so proud of being an American because of the Declaration of Independence, I'm so proud of being an American because of whatever, about World War II, whatever it may be, then you should also realize that whatever pride you have incurs obligations also from the past. And so one of the obligations we collectively have is about our system of race hierarchy over time, which has changed and transformed and is not the same thing in every era, but is a part of American society and has had deeply deleterious effects on many tens of millions of Americans. It results in pain and deprivation and death today in our society today. We have an obligation to that. And the past can help illuminate those obligations, better understand the contours of those obligations. And that's what it does. That's the extent of what it can do. Anyway, quick fact check. Slavery, racial slavery in the US wasn't created by black people. Again, it's very silly. Like, come on, let's be serious here. But beyond that, this need to try to create this fiction, I think, speaks to a deep discomfort with the obligations we have. All right, a real quick, what you might call a bedroom addendum to this video. I was editing it and then I was watching more of the creator I was responding to. And she said something kind of wild that I feel like I need to address. So here is what she said that was kind of wild.
Every single background and origin on the planet has been oppressed or enslaved or servants at some point in time. The white race did not invent slavery, but they were the race that ended it.
Not kind of wild, very wild. This is truly insane. There's so much that is wrong with this that it's sort of hard to get a handle on. First of all, as per the entire video, the notion that the black race or something is responsible for chattel slavery just as silly. It doesn't really fit the history whatsoever. It doesn't fit what we know. Second of all, the notion that you can pin the blame for something on a race is also crazy. It's a very silly thing. The white race and the black race, these aren't organic wholes of people who are doing something in concert. These are individual people, these are societies, and so on and so forth. And so I think you can say fairly that colonial American society sort of developed this form of chattel slavery. You can say that British imperial society helped expand the slave trade. And this is the thing we get into when people say things like, oh, well, the white race ended slavery. The transatlantic slave trade was run by European powers, by the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. Now, it is true that in the 19th century, the British then end their participation in the slave trade and began patrolling the seas to try to bring it to a stop. But it's important not to do this thing, and the historian Eric Williams has a quip about this, not to do this thing whereby you are almost acting as if the British engaged in slavery in order to end it. It's not what happened. There were changes in society. It wasn't some intrinsic thing that emerged out of the white race that led the British to want to end the transatlantic slave. It was like a number of social and political and economic factors. So, come on, right? But the other thing, and this is both narrow and broad, which is that whether it's the British case, whether it's the abolition of slavery here in the United States, these were the products of multiracial coalitions of people. Black Britons were part of that group of people who fought for and ended slavery in the British Empire. And Black Americans, especially runaway slaves, especially the formerly enslaved, were an integral part of the abolition movement, were really the driving force behind the abolition movement. Abolition doesn't pick up the steam it does if not for the steady stream of runaways, the way many of those runaways engaged in political activism after escaping slavery, the way many of those runaways wrote their stories down, told their stories, traveled the North, telling their stories, explaining the horrors of slavery. And in the most literal sense, the Union Army does not win the Civil War, if not for the contributions of 200,000 Black Americans, many of them formerly enslaved. And so this paternalistic notion that, again, the white race ended slavery in the United States or in the British Empire is just wrong. It's flatly wrong. And to sort of double back on the point I ended on the original kind of conclusion of this video, this to me speaks to someone who is trying to deal psychologically with a real discomfort that they have and are responding less to the history, or let me put this differently. They're not really reading history to understand what's happening. They're taking from things that they find in order to make an argument that can both rage bait, can satisfy their own psychological needs, and make themselves appear to be more knowledgeable than they are. It's a shame because this history is fascinating. It is inspiring. It should be an inspiration for everyone who reads it. And it should not be used for a blame game. It should be used to understand and to make sure that we are not repeating the mistakes of our ancestors and forefathers.